you know that I claim to be a language psychologist, which is not a recognized thing like all language and developmental psychologist, I say, right? And going to West Georgia, I came from a department was teaching psycholinguistics. So there is a field addressing language, and I'm in this dialogue all the time. So I will talk to it. I will explain psycholinguistics. I will explain language psychology, and in the course of that, I think I will come to this interest of yours to dialogical language technology. It's not tailored towards dialogism, but I think it's nevertheless very useful for you because you get the very base. What are we talking about? What kind of field are we in? What kind of branches are there? And we can branch out anytime you like, okay? So feel free to be interactive with me. And yes, so, and I'll also try to keep an eye on time. I don't want you to tire you too much. You know, when I'm talking, right? So you maybe have to say, it's kind of sign, okay? That's fine for me. So somebody has to reach out to the thing to make it work. The presentation is already on. I forgot to bring you a very nice picture of Chile as it comes up. In the meanwhile, I tell you. So the psychology program there, you come into it's a very nice house, a very nice building, and then there is a big poster, and it says, "Bienvenido a pensar." Do you understand that?
That's
Welcome.
something Spanish.
Good guess. Welcome is very good. Bienvenido is welcome. A pensar.
Think?
Ooh.
Welcome to thinking.
Oh, that's so cool.
I'm
I like
amazed
it.
by this poster for a doctoral program, and it's a beautiful, nice, very nice color. So it's a kind of warm brown red, and then it's like golden letters coming out, and it seems so appropriate. It's exactly what a doctoral program or what every teaching should do. So welcome to thinking together and speaking together. And this is still not there. Does it take so much time to warm up?
Doesn't that usually light up like that? The power button? Or not?
No, light is there.
I mean, it's definitely on.
Oh,
But,
there it
like,
is.
there's.
There it is.
Okay, so might
But
need to go
there's
to.
no connection to the source.
I'm gonna do that.
Thank you. Thank
Wow.
you, Mike. That
Yeah,
was
I did
magic.
that.
Oh, yeah, it's
I know by better
you did it.
time is, but
I don't. I'm not gonna lie. I don't even know how things work. Thanks, no problem.
So I started there. Esteemed colleagues, completely new on the program is the Language Day. More than anything else, the human language seemed to us appropriate to become the subject topic of a common debate between psychologists and representatives of other disciplines. If, as we envision, the contact and the interaction between language experts from different scientific origins such as linguistics, medicine, philosophy, and psychology meeting for our language discussion is achieved, if this is the case, we are allowed to expect substantial outcomes. The time is ripe, we believe. More precisely, the sciences that are most specifically and most closely related to the investigation of language are ripe for a language day at our Congress. This is the reason we put it on the program. So, this is the program that is expecting us. I herewith open the 12th Congress of the German Psychological Society. This was the opening address of Karl Bühler in 1931 in Hamburg. They had a language day. Goldstein was there, and many other very renowned psychologists of the day, linguists, like he said, medicine, psychology, philosophy. And they had a language day, and there are some proceedings of that 1931. The next Congress couldn't take place, and then war came in, or fascism, as you like. So it took a certain time for the Congress to reestablish. And most of, if you read the list of the attendees, then most of them were Jewish. A lot of them were Jewish. A lot of them were either killed or in exile. Karl Bühler had to go into exile to the United States. But this idea of the language day, just the very word is so interesting, and it was part of a psychology congress or conference, you know. And imagine we would have that in, I don't know, Syrian psychology or wherever, right? So, there is traces and oscillations I'd like to talk about. This is the first trace I'd like to talk about very shortly. And then I'd like to follow what happened to this field of language, to this prominent topic language. In the third point, I will follow the thread of doingness and activity as we do in our class, right? So this is a more subterranean thread, but it's very powerful, and it's there since ancient times, antiquity. I'm totally looking only into Western, the cultural Western hemisphere, right? So ancient Greece, Western Europe, this is the realm I'm looking. I don't know, I cannot talk to Indian language philosophy, which is very interesting and also very much to the process. And yeah, so for instance, so just let's be there. And then I will propose my understanding of language psychology, which can be said to go beyond the precious inner sight. You know what I mean by the precious inner sight, I think, and you already have a notion of what means beyond. Okay, so let's start with the traces and oscillation. Karl Bühler, for those who do not know him, so he was a German language theorist. He was trained as a physician, and he became a psychologist and language theorist in Würzburg, Munich, and Vienna. You know what was in Würzburg in these 1920s, 1020s? One of the Gestalt psychological schools. So in Würzburg there was Kafka, I think. So they had these experiments to how our ideas emerging. So they had a very special introspection technique. They were doing interviews to each other, and they interrupted the thinking process, and you had to write down what you were just thinking. Which was of course then rejected rapidly because the whole introspection idea was. Okay, so it's him, Munich, Würzburg, Munich, Vienna. In Vienna he was professor for psychology. This was the time he gave this address. He was the one time the president of the German-speaking countries in psychology. In 1940, he was forced to migrate to the USA. He was husband to Charlotte Bühler, you might be much more familiar with. So Charlotte Bühler, you say Charlotte, I think?
Charlotte,
okay. Charlotte Bühler, she became very famous, and she was also very successful in the United States. Karl was not. He never could link back to his very fruitful and vibrating work in Germany. So he taught a little bit and he did this and that, but it was never like before. So where did Bühler start? He started investigating thought processes, as I said, in Würzburg, and Gestalt perception. So this was the Würzburg start. And then semiotic processes became very central to him in order to rethink the whole psychology. So, you know, he also wrote the Crisis of Psychology. So you have another big figure at that same time as Vygotsky, speaking to the crisis of psychology and what can we do, and having also these major view perspective, very far-reaching perspective. How can we reformulate psychology to make sense of it? And it's always this struggle between natural sciences and human sciences. How do we integrate this? And Bühler was really an integrating mind. You see, he started as a physician, so he was very well set in natural sciences, but also in philosophy and so on. So you have this time where people had very integrative minds. It's very different than today, I would say, for several reasons. So semiotic processes, and he envisions a psychology on the base of the idea of life as a self-regulating process and signal exchange. Sounds very modern. Sounds very like Varela and these guys, right? Systems theory and inactivism and all that. And this is the broader context. So life, this is also an important word. You have the life philosophies in the same time, Lebensphilosophie, life as a self-regulating process, signal exchange, and it's in this context that you have language as an event of what he calls an irreducible system of two. Okay? So language is not just addressed of one of the multiple subjects or phenomena, but it has a clear place within the architecture of a new psychology, and particularly prominent through signal exchange. So this is maybe something you might have seen somewhere. This is taught in every linguistic basic course, like in this way more. So you have doesn't matter. The sender, the receiver, and the objects. Remember what we did yesterday? It's exactly that. The one, the other, and the world. Okay? So you have always, and Z is the sign. And so you have different relationships here, you have different, the sign has a triple function, and it has its representation, its appeal, and its expression. If I say, help me, Mike, then it's expression, right? It's also representation. If it's, it's strongly appeal, but of course also expression. You can have a poem about, like the autobiographical stuff you were doing yesterday, right? In the other class, it's very much expression. It's not so much about things out of the world, but it's always all the three of these. Okay, I don't want to go into this too deep, it's so interesting, but anyways. So be aware that, like the ZPD, this is the very shrinked form of Buddha. Every linguistic student learns this triadic model, and that's it. Okay? So Bühler is not read, was not read for a very, very long time. It might restart, as Vygotsky is also not really read. You have the ZPD and you have a nice graph you always put on your slide, and that's it, right? So they're very similar in this respect. So these two related people, this is the irreducible system of two and their relationship to the world, objects and states of affair. You have a language notion which sees language from the start as a holistic event. It's a complete event. It involves always two partners acting within a concrete perceptual field, so it's grounded, right? It's here and now, it's this field. And we have an activity field towards a reality, just like what we do. I'm speaking about Bühler, we act towards each other, okay? It's somehow very trivial, even simple, right? But it's, the good thing, but it was not. Remember, Saussure was coming up, or was already very famous at the same time. And the structuralistic notion of the sign is devoid of people, right? It's,
Devoid of the receiver,
yeah,
of the appeal actually.
yeah, yeah.
Well, he had the two different ideas, but he had them disconnected, right? I don't know, like the parole and
The what?
I don't know. Doesn't he have he does have like,
Socio, you are talking about socio?
yeah, doesn't he
Yes.
have language?
Lang
as
and parole.
spoken?
Yes.
Yeah.
Lang and
yeah.
parole.
Language and parole, and this is dissociated. So
Yeah.
language as a system and language as spoken. And linguistics is only about language as a system. And now you have to look at the signs as they relate to each other.
Love you
And,
too.
yeah, and then look at the systems of signs, right? Okay. So, one important moment here is that we are not just pointing to reality, we are rendering reality visible in a very specific sense, making it a reality for us at all. So it's another reality. We are transcending this reality. We are not just speaking about the things that are there. Like now, we're speaking about things that are not there. We're creating realities, right?
Dr. Berteau, how Buehler is represented in the atypical linguist theorist of
In the
Ma-
typical language
ma-
studies,
language theories or the language studies, they do not mention appeal there. They only mention representation instead of appeal, and this
Yeah.
makes a difference because appeal will be corresponding to the activity, while the representation will not.
exactly. And I give you another
Good point.
piece to that story. Can I switch here? Oh, I put it on.
Yeah, the appeal part doesn't seem as familiar to me as expression and representation.
Why? Expression is.
As in, it's probably not taught.
They only show.
Why? Just you look for a theoretical reason.
Well, I mean,
Whom is this expression tied to?
the self.
The ego, right? And representation is this, we are representing the world, we're putting labels on things.
Subject, object.
That's it. I don't need another subject. Why should I need another subject? So this is a good point. So we have really a kind of cutting off this part, right? So we have only the sender and his deep expression, which is of course totally subjective and has nothing to do with
Yeah.
anybody else.
So that would be Saussurian, signifier and signified. There is no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you have really
Interpretation.
representation. Okay, now let me switch to the next slide.
In the middle, you said was like,
Yeah.
was the example that you used for appeal?
Yes, I appeal to the other. I can also say, please would you be so kind to come and give me a help with my new paper. You know, it's so difficult and it can also be very elaborated, right?
I mean, expression then always has to be an appeal as well. There
Exactly.
always-
You
there's
express
always an-
like you an autobiographical essay. You just say, I'm the daughter of a king, and you know I'm very famous, and so you will have to really respect me. Blah, 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 no? So you speak about yourself, you express something, or you say my emotions today are so low, you know, whatever. Okay.
So does discourse analysis kind of focus in on appeal actually and kind of ignore the other two?
I would say discourse analysis tends to focus on expression, assuming that expression will just translate some inner status with faith, without, and the other would be the interviewer who is just out of the game, right? I'm detached, I'm just asking for what lies inside you. Good questions, and it still doesn't go forward. So something is, I did something to that thing, and
It just
it's
Was
in
that
another
wants
way.
appeal?
Yeah, it's okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
synchronic move.
Okay, so let's look quickly at his language book, the book on language theory, Bula. It's called Sprachtheorie, you see that language theory. Die Darstellungsfunktion der Sprache, the function of
Represent.
Darstellung. Now what's Darstellung? It's translated as representation. If you look at Darstellung, which is a Germanic word, in German you have the possibility to go for the Latin or for the Germanic word, which is nice. You don't have this double possibility, neither in English nor in French. You are restricted to the Latin in English and in French. You have only representation, okay? In English you have a lot of Germanic words too, but for this one you don't have. You have to say representation. For instance, daughter is a Germanic word, knight, okay? Representation is Latin. You don't have any other possibility. At least you didn't create one. Okay, so Darstellung. It's made of da, which means there, with a motion towards, so at. So da, it's showing. It's showing you, okay? Putting there at people. Describing, constructing, producing. This is this Darstellen, okay? So for instance, a picture or a theater performance would be called a Darstellung. And you have the Department of Arts, or is called Darstellende Künste, so the performative arts. So you have even performance is Darstellung, okay? So you see how far we get from representation.
Representative art sounds really boring.
Right? It's terrible. And this is very boring when you say language is a representational tool. It's totally boring, and you get just, oh, where did we go? It's presentation. I love this. Yes.
Yeah.
It turns totally the picture, you know, it shifts everything almost. And
It makes it present and alive.
but this is the bad thing with a translation. You lose it otherwise, or you have to write I don't know if they have a new English translation even, and one of the most famous German Bühler researchers, Achim von Eschbach, he translated it with, but I don't know if there's something in the introduction about that.
So is this different from social constructionism?
Yeah. So it's more social constructivism, okay? So the object and states of affairs are constructed together in language, okay? But it's interesting, Bühler has he has the idea that there's some kind of faithful relationship of faithfulness between what we present and what is there. So it's not totally abstract. It is, but it doesn't lose totally ground, which is a very interesting idea of faith. So he critiques Cassira, for instance, because Cassira is totally into this abstract, so language represents in a totally detached way from the here and now. So with Bühler, what I'm doing is dementalize the mental with Bühler and Vygotsky. So you dementalize means of course the mental is mental, but it's grounded. So it's more than saying it's embodied. It's saying it is anchored in an experience, in a field, in a common field of perception, and all that, right?
But that's very different from the Wittgensteinian or Saussurean tradition,
Yes.
which, because for them, language does not represent real objects. No, it could not.
No, it cannot. And for Bühler, it's also different, but it's still different than from Wittgenstein, I would say. But this might be another discussion. I think Wittgenstein never stopped to be very suspicious of language. So language, he has the metaphor of the witchcraft, this, how do you say that, abducting language, abusing the
Abducting.
thing,
Abducting,
abducting
yeah.
language, thinking. So you have thinking and then comes language and right?
Mm-hmm.
So and which is of course feminine and the thinking is a pure male, which is, so you can really read these kind of gendered attribution.
Well,
And there isn't really a suspicion still in the late Wittgenstein. He tries to be realistic with language, saying, okay, language is working by language games, and we have all these meanings, and it's very difficult to make to philosophize without being aware of how language works for our understanding and for our thinking. But he never acknowledges, I have the sense he not acknowledges, like Vygotsky does, or Voloshinov, or Bühler, the very powerful moment, the formative moment of language. It's not simply negative. It's not simply positive neither. It depends. You cannot, I mean, for me it doesn't make much sense to say it's wonderful or it's terrible. It's just a kind of fact, and then let's see how it works, and then let's see how we manage it, like in education, politics, and all that kind of. Okay, so we are, I'm going back. We have here a presentation, okay? We have a presentation. We have a speaker, a listener, and a presentation. So this really shifts the whole thing. Remember, we had, beforehand we had said, there is an ego, his expression, and a world. Okay? So only tweaking a little bit and looking at the, translation also, as always, made it really a difference.
But if the expression can never be the object, the notion of representation just, I don't see why representation has to be this deadening static, because it seems like representation is still a movement there at, like it's like I'm representing,
okay.
I'm
If you
putting
take it
forth.
like representing, as a presenting another time, that's nice, but it's taken like a form of sophisticated copy of what is represented.
Objectification.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah, but which,
It's a so you can say, of any representation, you can say, is it true or wrong? You have a truth value assignable to it. Because does it match or not the state of affair, for instance, right? So it's fixed, it has a truth value which is independent of context, it's independent of the speaker and listener, it's context independent, right? It's a pure act of reason. It's not tied into a pragmatic activity.
okay.
Okay, so this is the problem with representation. It's very much in the tradition of the reason enlightenment philosophers like Descartes and all these people, right? So this is really, and before that, Aristotle, it starts already there. Okay, so there's a problem with the German. If you say, okay, let's read it differently and take the movement of redoing something, but it will never be the same, right? You would then have to say each representation is a new one.
Well, and that's, I take it dialectically that way, in the more, right, like the notion of my representation, when I say hat, I can't, like in that very sense certainty sort of way, right? Like I can never, the hat is never what I'm saying it is, and so it's always in this process of, like, it can never be this, it's always a representation of
it's a
the
generalization. First of all,
yeah.
a word is a generalization.
And due to that fact that it can still hold, it doesn't have to have this kind of totalizing effect of like, okay, the word equals what this
There's
is.
another
Is that-
hat.
Right, like, which it, right, and it can be, depending on the way in which it's,
I think
Right.
it is.
right? Like, absolutely. Like, but that's in, that,
Noah agrees already, so that's it.
which is where it's like, right, is the process of going back, which doesn't make it so, it makes it more live, it makes it more active, and it does make it more messy insofar as like, okay, well, we can never hammer down, you know, we can never
No,
say
we cannot
this
hammer
word
down,
means
yeah.
anything other than something
And the issue is
amorphous.
also,
like-
how do you relate thinking to any spiritual and embodied and social activity? If
Mhm.
you cut it off,
Mhm.
then you have the problem of relinking it back,
Mhm.
right? So representationalism is a very big chapter in linguistics and philosophy, and it has, of course, it's practical for certain reasons, but it doesn't work for others for a natural language.
Mhm.
So,
Cool, right.
okay, so in this reading at least, so I don't want to dogmatize. Okay, so the traces are fading. We can ask what happened after Bühler. We had World War II, and we have the rise of information technology
Mm.
due to war, right?
Mhm.
Be aware that all technology advancements are due to wars, and in the context of wars, we have particularly codifying techniques in World War II, which are very advanced, or became very advanced. It was the time of John
Newman?
Newman? Yeah,
The-
John Newman?
Yeah,
Really?
the computer science guy?
Yeah, computer science, okay. Codifying is very important, you know, to decrypt the German codes was extremely important, and they did. So this was in the UK, for instance. The transfer of information, so transferring information for this reason became something like a total figure. It's a kind of thinking figure, a topic that eats up everything else. Everything becomes information. Everything is transfer of information.
Mhm.
Okay? So you cannot even speak, the term of information deleted meaning, the term
Mhm.
of meaning.
Mhm.
And it was people like Bruna in cultural psychology who took meaning back, and then you have meaning making, and this discourse in cultural psychology, for instance, or maybe also in psychoanalysis, I don't know. But in mainstream psychology, you have information, right?
Mhm.
This explains everything. In this context, you have a clear instrumentalization of language as an information carrier. It's a rejection of redundancy as non-information. And true, for an information channel, if you have twice the same bit sequence, it's redundant.
Mhm.
And it's non-economic, right? So you eat up capacities and you do not do nothing new, okay? But if you have a poem like a rose is a rose is a rose, it's not redundant, of course not.
Mhm.
And if I say twice the same thing to a kid to make the thing more pointed, right? It's
Mhm.
also not redundant.
Mhm.
My students might disagree with you.
Okay.
Mhm.
So then there was this idea of the channel between coding and decoding heads. So the sender and the receiver are really taken literal, like there is a coding head, you code, and the other one decodes, and between them there is a channel where you, just like the computer nowadays, right?
Mhm.
So this is the starting idea. It's Shannon and Weaver, and Shannon and Weaver, they were mathematicians, and they were never, they never said it's for language. They only said it's for computers and coding and all that, right? But the linguists were totally happy. The linguists have the same problem as the psychologists. They want to be a real science on any cost, at any cost,
Mhm.
right? Okay. In human sciences, we have, and it's nice how this echoes the information technology rise, because you have this obsession with structures. So algorithmic structures or science structures, right? So the syntax of how signs are chained to each other. This is really, really important.
Mm.
So in structuralism, the well-ordering of science into systems to be deciphered, and this is really echoed by the algorithmic working of the understanding machine, we can call it. So syntax prevails, not pragmatics. Pragmatics would be what we do, right? How we talk, we speak. Really looking at the chains, and the chains have to be well ordered and well formed. This is Chomsky's word, well formed syntactical chains, right? So if you have exactly this, right? So this is not a syntactical well formed chain. It's but you understand. Okay. Then what happened to language psychology? So of course I'm a little bit in Germany with that. The last one was 1954, and funny enough, it is in the same year that you have a summer seminar between several people coming together, and they created this new discipline called psycholinguistics by purpose. So it's a field that was created just like we sit together and we say, okay, we need something new. And there were anthropologists, linguists, information technologists, psychologists, behavioral psychologists at that time, right? So also, yeah, special. And they said, we need something to address language within this special paradigms of that time, okay? So structural anthropology, behaviorism, information technology in the beginning, and they created psycholinguistics. And psycholinguistics had always had this, you have the task to discover the reality of the language model and the processing model we develop. So in mathematics, in linguistics, and philosophy. They had then to do experiments, laboratory experiments, of course, and then look for the reality of all these entities that were proposed. And this is what they do by today. Okay, so it's a field, it was never autonomous. It was always, okay, we have to do this. And then every changing fashion in information technology, in mathematics, in linguistics, the anthropologists were rapidly out of this story. They just left, right? They were there at the first meeting and then they left. And they really went into performance a lot. You have Del Hines and Steve Gertz and all these people. They are very much closer to what we try to do with this Voloshinov stuff than the psycholinguists, okay? They really looked into what people do in the field. So they were in this doing this, okay? Okay, so a new field created. And this was imported back, so to speak, to Europe, where you had no language psychology anymore because the important people were just no more there. You have some European counterpositions. For instance, a German one, he is really very, very, very good. He died in 1982. And then you have a whole bunch of people in Northern Europe. They were always a little bit different because of through Finland, they had relationships to Soviet Union and Russia, and it was also the route where black copies of the Soviet texts came in, right? So they read Vygotsky very early. And so they read it and they understood it and they worked with that. So Ragnar Rometfeit is one of them. Per Linell, maybe you know Per Linell, right? He's Swedish. Rometfeit is Norwegian. So you have their kind of very interesting school going on, and they're also very strong in activity theory. Okay, so you have a very few spots, but all in all, there's a powerful movement towards psycholinguistics, putting language into labs and brain and reaction time measurements, okay? The preferred experiment is word recognition. Is this a word or is this not a word? And then you prime differently, and okay, they try to go to the sentence level, they try to go even to the conversation level now, which is, and in Eastern Europe, we have something that Hermann, the German one I was just mentioning, says it was never psycholinguistics. The Russian psycholinguistics has never been psycholinguistics, although it calls itself as such in English translations. And this was the bias of the translations of that time. If you see language psychology in a language in some kind of other language, you translate it by psycholinguistics because it's brand new and we have something to show, right?
Yeah.
So it has always been language psychology. It's interesting how he makes the difference.
Mhm.
That is, it never considered itself as science that has to prove the psychological reality of primarily linguistic concepts or theories or models. It came from psychology.
Mm.
And here you have also the ambivalence.
Interesting.
Do we belong to linguistics or psychology?
Mhm.
Hermann wants it on the psychological side.
Mhm.
Go away from Chomsky and all this terrible generative grammatic. And it's still difficult, and I find it very difficult to have to decide. There is no decision possible between linguistics and psychology. Thinking language without a psychological dimension is very strange to me.
Mhm.
And thinking psyche and psychological processes without language is also strange.
Mhm.
But you see, we are between the chairs.
Hmm.
Right? Okay, so this is modern 21st century psycholinguistics. I just read, so she was, Anne Kaplan, she was director of Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands, still very, very powerful and a lot of research there. And she says a psycholinguist can be primarily a psychologist, ultimately concerned to understand and explain the mental structures and processes involved in the use of language. But to be properly a psycholinguist, such a psychologist needs also to be concerned about why language has certain universal characteristics. So this is the overarching or the basic curiosity for them is what's universal.
Mhm.
It's exactly the contrary interest for all the Soviet and societally oriented language psychology. So it's not what's situated, what is particular to societies, it's what's universal. And you have to go very, very basic. So they were looking at color terms, then directions like north, south, west, and structures, and they're still doing this. So you have the look for universals. This is a whole, in philosophy you have also this is a very strong, powerful curiosity of people. I never had that, and some people do, some people do not. It's also kind of, I don't know, it's, in the end you have your affective ethos to things, right? You cannot really say, I'm right because, no, people kind of stand to this, right? I personally think that knowing about these universals would not bring us very far.
But isn't the triad that you talked about before universal? The fact that there's always a speaker, a listener, and a world, like that
I would say
presents
so,
a
yeah, but I would
universal
also
structure.
not say it's universal. I would not,
Hmm.
using, yes, you can say this, but using the word seems, I never use it, I must say, but
Hmm.
you could say it, yes, you could say it, but this is a, how can I say, like say human, have activity or are active mediated beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very general
Mm-hmm.
position or positioning or statement, yes. A universal in this sense is looking for a feature, characteristics in languages that are everywhere,
Hmm.
in all languages. So it's much more oriented towards a structure,
Okay.
okay, a system.
Oh, this language itself, got
This
it.
is interesting because as of the late 19th century,
Uh-huh.
the early 20th century, when some Europeans were involved in translations,
Yes.
of text in other areas. That appeared to have been their guiding principle, such that just go to the literal meaning. You just have to tell the indigenous what's this, so that the other aspect. So the universal characteristics of language must have been at the maybe preliminary stage
Yeah.
as of.
Yes, and in the end, it eliminates the particularities, the social, contextual
Right.
specificities. It eliminates the speakers and the listeners,
Great point.
and it has a it's also quite
Yeah.
colonizing from this perspective, right?
Well, we killed God, so we need to replace them with something kind
Yeah,
of
universals
universal.
is a good
True.
yes.
Good point.
But Dr. Berteau, the rules or the by which that language is interacting with the receiver, sender, culture, all that would be something universal, or that would also be context specific?
Good question.
I would not say the rules, how they're interacting, it's, but I know what you mean. Yes, I would say so. So I would take another word than rule and need a little bit more discussion, but in principle, yes, I would say so. So because it's mediated now, or mediation, it's
Yeah.
exactly your subject, right? How we are mediated and how our symbolic mediation means relates as, how this triangle
Yeah.
works by the side. Not only that we are related, but we are related by a symbolic means, which is the language side, right? So this is really very specific and specifically human, as far as this kind of language, right? I don't know, maybe there are also, okay, I cannot know.
Well, and maybe it's pointing to processes that could be kind of universal, but maybe the particular framing
Yeah.
has contingent contextual
Exactly,
elements. Like
exactly.
symbolic mediation is not something you might get in a different culture, even if they're doing similar kinds of processes.
No,
as that.
indeed, the statement would be you will always find symbolic mediation.
Yeah, but those words, framing it that way, like it might be faithful to some sort of process that it's presenting, representing, whatever. But that sort of framing of that process. which
You
I-
mean how it's actually done, by which kind of, what do you mean?
No, how you're understanding it. Like, there's I don't know if I can explain this. I mean, just the concept symbolic mediation is comes from a tradition and has particular features that if another tradition was trying to understand
I
the
understand,
process.
I understand.
yeah.
But this is the theoretical level.
Yeah.
So you would propose this on a theoretical level, and then you would, and it's totally independently from that, if we regard ourselves as symbolically mediated, symbolic active, whatever, the practices that we have, you have totally oral cultures, and they have totally sophisticated symbolic mediations going on. Look at the calculating systems we have, also the writing systems, but also oral poetry, poetry and memorizing, right? So we have all these different mediational
Even
types.
Turkey has a language which is just whistling.
Yeah, there is also this on the Canary Islands.
It's only
right?
whistling. Yeah.
But they have a regular language,
Yes,
and
yeah.
they have the whistling,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Okay, so but you see, so you would pretend this is the basic of the human condition, to be related to each other and to be related not simply by sheer intersubjectivity, but by symbolic means. Okay, mediated to the other, to reality.
And to yourself.
So, right. So, and this is where the self-understanding comes in, where you were so nicely yesterday and then always saying, sometimes I don't understand myself,
Yes.
or something like that, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So there is no automatic match. And if you
Okay.
remember back what we covered in this triangle, saying speaker, expression, and world, this assumes that the speaker is always in a very nice match with himself and herself. So there is no friction, and the irritation comes here nicely, right? So so you don't have
Wow.
the irritation by
Wow.
and it's even dangerous. It's a kind of, yeah, you understand.
Mhm.
I don't have the word sometimes.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
skip a little bit what so there is I looked at the homepage of the Psycholinguistics Max Planck Institute. So this is a very, very wealthy, it's a research institute in
Mhm.
Germany. You have different Max Planck institutes. They're very wealthy, it's totally paid by German taxes, and they do only research.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tomasello, ever heard of Tomasello?
Tomasello.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
he is working at the Max
Cultural
Planck
psychology.
Institute for Anthropology in Leipzig. It's, so it's a wonderful place, but yes, so
That's
this is
awesome.
whatever, this language department, I can send you, I can share this, it's not a problem.
That'd be
I can
great.
read everything. Okay, so at the heart of their research, and I just looked up, she said, the language psychologist that said, it's the guiding theoretical principle that there is a small set of basic cognitive components,
Huh.
universal,
Uh-huh.
that in different combinations cover all of the ways language is used in everyday and laboratory contexts.
That's very
So a
Chomsky.
small set of basic cognitive components,
Yeah.
okay? And we don't, cognitive components is like saying this is totally neutral, it's totally abstract,
Yep.
because otherwise you could never fulfill all these roles, right?
Yep.
So you have to strip off everything.
Mhm.
And it's representational.
Maybe even less.
Maybe less so,
Yeah.
right? I was about to say, before representation.
Representation is already linked
Like,
to
way
something.
too agreed. Like, this is
Yeah.
super insular, very,
Okay, they want to identify these and da-da-da. Okay, good. So they're working at that.
hmm.
And now there's relation between this language theory, language psychology we were studying before World War II, and what we get at it after World War II is completed. The cognitive sciences has established, and they are the science where the site where language is researched. I looked up at APA just for curiosity, and they have 56 divisions, none of which is devoted to language.
Wow.
There is
That's
no
crazy.
language-related term, nothing about narrative or language acquisition or discourse or nothing. Nothing. You have very remote things like, I don't know. So, it's magic, disappeared, right? And in theoretical terms, it disappeared in the precious inner side, where you have, it's in cognition, right?
Yeah.
And so one version, the other version is it's a transparent medium to deeper processes.
What does that mean?
So as psychologists, we can just look through, it's like you take this and then you can read, if you practice, you could read my inner processes, right? But it's just a window to something deeper.
Oh, wow, somebody didn't read me Derrida, like, as far as, to think that we could look at the word and it opens up some sort of transparent look into a deeper process is highly philosophically problematic, just in that,
Absolutely.
like, what?
Totally, and it's also linguistically problematic.
Huh.
Yes. So this is the whole methodological individualism we have here with several things. And you have always this phrase of using language. And when we use language and the using language, exactly. So this also always assumes there is somewhere is language, and then you put it to use, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I have some tools, and sometimes I take them and I use them, and then I put them back, okay? We were talking about, I was mentioning Gadamer yesterday.
Yep.
And he says, I can never do
Nope.
this. It's like it
It
glues
adheres
to
to
me,
you,
right?
yes.
It glues to me, and every time I drink, this bottle would change its size, its color,
Mhm.
its weight, whatever, and I also would change. My hand would grow or become smaller, whatever, right? So imagine the constant shape, constantly. And we do this together, of course. I do not do this alone, okay?
Mm.
Interesting. So I like to show you one of the important moments in Greek antiquity, because of course the whole story didn't start after World War II. It started earlier, and I think there was really a very, very important moment for logic, mathematics, and philosophy and language theory. So we just said, just a step before that, we said that Lula presents us with a system of two, and we have to add there's an audience to this system of two, right? Be it there or not.
Mhm.
We have to say there are others. There will always be others, okay? So we have what I call the rhetorical field.
Mm.
There's always me and you and the others listening. And if they are not there, we have the Nelson community, we have the community of psychologists, we have the community of mothers, we have the community of sassy women, of whatever, okay?
So we're talking
We have-
societal here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Get societal, okay?
Mhm.
The
Ma-
social is.
Micah doesn't know the difference between social
You
and
have to tell him. I trust you, okay?
What's
So
why two? This is kind of, from trying to come at it from like the Deleuzian perspective, they're resistant to two-ness.
Mhm.
So I don't, why two?
It's also resistant to two-ness. You have a third one, but it is of a different quality. If you,
Yeah,
I think if you add a third, a fourth, you can have as many as you want, but you have at least two.
Yeah.
So now we have more than one, more than two. But importantly, the third, and this is a little bit confusing because you count, but the third is a new quality, so it's not really a third person, it's a different, the audience has a different status, okay?
Because you're not directly addressing them.
So we have a rhetorical field, so far so good?
Mhm.
Are you
And,
okay
and
with
this is what
Mhm.
you're calling the rhetorical.
Yeah, when we have three.
Is the audience.
So we have self, other, audience, okay? Or we have this triangle and it's surrounded by an audience, or you have an amphitheater. Imagine the Greek theater, right?
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
That's what I was just
You have
thinking.
the audience and you have the field of action or the theater of action, right? People acting and watching, the others watch and shout and yell and heckle and whatever.
Yeah, Nietzsche unpacks it real
He's
well.
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
In Birth of Tragedy, he speaks very much towards all of what you're saying there. Is the
But take
notion
also football stadiums today,
Mhm.
right? It's same happening. You
Mhm.
have actors and you have the audience and everybody, and they are all important, of course.
of. Mhm.
Okay, publicness, activity, praxis. Good, so this is the triad, self, other, audience. So now, what happens in the 4th century before Christ? This is a weird, seems to be a weird date, but it isn't. It's the shift in ancient Greece, it's the shift from oral consciousness and oral society to a literal one.
Yep.
It's where you can read Socrates complaining, now we have the written,
Yep.
the writing, and people will forget everything. They will think they need only to consult books where they have to consult people.
Mhm.
Because a book will never reply to you.
Mhm. Which is why Socrates never wrote.
So he is at the threshold between this oral and the literal.
Mhm.
The Greek alphabet is invented like 200 years before that, at least 200, it's more than. But it takes a time to have a society which is literal,
Mhm.
that people, so it changes consciousness, as you know,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And people doing research in writing know that it changes totally a whole society if there is written language available for everybody. And
Yeah.
alphabetic language writing was basically available to everybody. Okay?
Mhm.
They needed for political purposes. They had, on the walls. There were many things written on the walls, just like.
So today you would talk shit about smartphones.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so 4th century before Christ, the trilogic thinking of rhetoric, this. Now, from on the rhetoric, on the theoretical base, is curtailed by Socrates, insisting on the dialogue and consciously suppressing the audience as the real addressee of the dialogues. So there is always an audience also for Socrates, but he puts on stage very much this me-you dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a theoretical, philosophical purpose in this.
Thank you.
Doing this, Socrates finally uses the other to eliminate the question, his question, her question, to the benefit of a statement of knowledge. So it's not, do you think truth is valid also for the barbarians down in Syria? The question is eliminated towards truth is valid for everybody on earth because humans can reach the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It's only this statement. And eliminating the other's question resulted in eliminating the other himself. And this is where you got this truncated model of there's only a speaker and the representation of the world. Okay?
So you're saying it's a universalization that doesn't actually encapsulate all of the things? Yeah.
You cut off the field. Okay? Just like you cut off the other. And from the activity viewpoint, you cut off the one who asked you. As you were saying, truth is valid for everybody on earth. You were cutting off the question of the sophist or of the student or whomever, the question, right? I just read an article today about the importance for children to ask questions and that we have to teach them more into question asking and education have to enhance this. Yeah, why do we have to do this? Because we eliminated the question as a silly moment of stupidity.
See, but I'm confused here because that does. I've read the Socratic dialogues, and that is by no means what I see there. I mean, it's specific. I mean, his whole purpose is question answer. To
Yeah.
not assert anything is to say, I'm addressing questions from the and even this notion of statements of knowledge to me that seems to be walking back in the audience. The notion now he speaks towards when you read the Republic, and he's like, okay, I'm talking to Telemachus here.
Yeah.
There's this movement towards all of a sudden he's shifting that through the question of the other and through
Yeah.
the particular situatedness of that context, that action, that moment, those movements. He then bridges that out to let's be able to speak about something that's not purely rhetorical, because that was this whole point is right, like prior to that it was just whoever can make the better sophist, right? Whoever can make the better argument is true. Whoever can sway the opinions of the people is true. And this movement towards something that is much more legitimately argumentative as
Yeah.
opposed to
This is
pseudo-argumentative
Exactly.
seems to bring
Exactly.
back in exactly what
No.
the other, that brings back in this
No,
notion
the
of
other
speaking
way
to the
around.
audience.
The other way around. So let's unpack this rapidly. So his point is that truth cannot be relative to the one who speaks,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mhm.
So because I'm only a better defendant of my argument, like
Mhm.
a sophist,
Mm-hmm.
I won the battle, the word battle, so my truth is valid. So
Mhm.
this is the logos battle, right?
Mhm.
Better logos wins.
Mhm.
So it's true. So true is totally dependent on this activity in the field. This is something he didn't want for legitimate reasons, I totally agree, right? So he wants to detach truth from this, he doesn't want it to be contextual sensitive.
Okay.
He wants it to be normative.
Okay.
He uses the whole rhetorical toolbox
Mhm.
for this.
Mm-hmm.
Totally agreed. But the theoretical move is to detach, and this is why statement of knowledge, to detach the dependent truth, so to speak,
Okay.
from its situation and to make it a clear one which is always valid independent of the context.
Mm-hmm.
And how he then creates this second world of ideas which
Mhm.
are there and always valid. And then you have
Yes.
manifestations which are more or less perfect,
Or imperfect.
more imperfect,
Yeah.
right? And you have to then, you have the difficulty to relate them back to
Back to
the
the-
thing before.
Mm.
So there's a whole
Versus-
philosophy then on that.
Mhm.
But you know, he's such an interesting character. He has this ambivalence. So he's really contra the sophists.
Mhm.
And remember that Plato writes that.
Yeah.
And Plato had to. One philosophy teacher told me this one day when I read it, and I found it very convincing. So Plato's position is to make sure that somebody as Socrates, who he loved so much as a teacher, would never again be put to death
Mhm.
by arguments made in the field.
Yep.
Right?
Arbitrary
So-
ones.
Of course, but this is how we work.
Hmm.
There is God is death.
Hmm.
There is no outside instance. And so this is the start of modernity somehow. The struggle with this, where do we put our validity of our instance, right?
Mhm.
And we decided 1948 to have the human rights,
Mm.
which is a major, major step in this whole struggle. This is Plato's struggle for Socrates. Socrates should never have been put to death.
Mhm.
So we have to make sure that truth is not dependent on the speaker.
Mhm. But that
With this
detethers it
goes
from.
a very strong devaluation of politics, rhetorics,
Mhm.
and then also poetry. All this is outside of truth. You
That's
cannot
correct.
reach
Good point.
truth.
Good
Okay?
point.
And you have logics and pure thinking.
Mhm.
Okay? And then you
They
have
separate
this
it out.
really a strong separation. And look at all the Aristotelian books. You have logics, poetics, rhetoric. Look at where he okay.
Okay, well,
So
that's a
you
good
see,
point. That's a good
you
point.
make the boxes.
Yeah.
Not withstanding, or do you say that? Nonetheless,
Mhm.
he uses rhetoric, right?
Mhm.
And it's very interesting how he does it.
Mhm.
You can make it. I can do this one day with you.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
The discourse analysis of Socrates' dialogues.
Mhm.
It's very interesting how it works.
It's awesome. He's a tactician.
The role of the other. What's the role of the other? I
Mhm.
looked only at the listener for some dialogues. What does he do, and when does he do it?
Mhm.
It's So, agreed?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, I love you.
Thank you.
A little bit
Appreciate
at
that.
a time. Maybe we have to meet again. I don't know. Okay.
That's interesting because my pet theory around Plato creating the forms in that separate world was that maybe, he'd been in a relationship with his mentor and had been dissociated from, the pederasty, the fact he was having sex with the older man, so he was dissociating and created the
Yeah.
forms. I don't believe it though.
I don't know if they had sex, if this was so important. Maybe it's a fantasy we have towards them. I'm not so sure.
Mhm.
I don't know enough about that, but male and younger and older male things, it's very specific, and still today in Greece it's different, and I don't know, we are. Okay, but so this is one narrative, a proposal I think in here. So what's important also in Plato, and we will talk about this very shortly tomorrow in class, you have this shift to vision.
Mhm.
So you see truth.
Mhm.
You have this vision of the ideas, right?
Mhm.
And language stopped before
Mhm.
that. It's ineffable. It's beyond language.
Mhm.
And you see the truth is vision. And it's not the listening, it's not audition, the senses in time, okay?
Mhm.
So you leave behind the other and the spoken listened word, and you are in a still vision of truth. A kind of enlightenment
Yep.
stage, right?
That's exactly right.
And you have in all the Indo-European languages, you have in all the words talking to understanding, knowledge, there is light. Something with light and vision.
Mhm.
So enlightenment is of course one of the best examples. There is something to this, of course. So
Yeah.
blindness and vision. So in Oedipus,
Oedipus, yeah.
Oedipus.
Mhm. But in
For instance.
the notion of though that vision becomes truth, or vision becomes associated with truth, that's metaphorical though. I mean, there's so much of this that we have to recognize is, right, this symbolic representation of the symbol, the fact that, okay, we're using words and the notion of the ineffable. It's like, okay, especially if we're talking about how, right, the word can never capture, there's always something left behind, there's always something lacking in the word's association, its equitability with truth. There has to be some kind of metaphorical component that allows there to be the unknown to be associated with something known, right? Like the stream of consciousness, something that's like, all right, I can understand this word, and I can then understand something that's very ineffable or hard to grasp through something that's graspable.
Can you tell me the struggle you just have? I don't understand quite.
Well, you make mention of there's this falling away of language and a premising of vision, as opposed to the but I'm seeing the notion of, when I think of the like truth as vision, when Plato moves to vision as being,
Other
I'm
things
taking
can
that as
be hidden,
metaphorical, as
too.
part of language.
Things
It's a
can be
metaphorical
hidden from
process.
your hearing, and then you hear.
Mm-hmm.
So just
Yes.
just shortly, of course it's a metaphorical process,
Mm-hmm.
but science is made of that. Our conceptions work like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so nobody would say truth is it's only vision, right?
Mhm.
I mean, this is too simple and also too cryptic.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at how it's enacted, how theories work and what is valid and not, you see it's tied into the vision. It's tied into the still moment, into the seeing.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So if you want to understand, for instance, Plato's cave or whatever, or the ideas, it's really, if you have, what is that, Phaedros, the dialogue where he talks about the function of eros to
Mhm.
reach truth. So
Mhm.
eros is important, so it's what we need also in education, so there is an affective relation, you're taking the other and you are going towards the truth. But in the very last moment, eros is gone and language is gone.
And
You're
you're left
on-
with the vision.
enjoying the vision.
Okay. All right.
You have no idea how useful the last slide on this one,
Mhm.
and the idea of truth as vision.
Mhm.
Especially this era, I'm having Bible study with young undergraduate students in some group, and we are reading John's Gospel. And looking at this time, and what Mike just said, truth as vision, and John uses that, this is the God that you didn't see, he has appeared. And even this is the one we've seen. And the New Testament written in Greek, I mean the vision of the Greeks and all that,
Yeah.
the cultural import.
Exactly.
But,
I'm looking at this thing.
but go back to the breakdown of the word that means therewith, putting there at or presenting. You could also look at it that way,
Yeah.
like at
This is
Jesus
the
that
one.
way,
Yeah.
right? So it doesn't, like therewith, but
Right.
that, it does also imply, but I'm
But
proposing
but
a-
the thing is that you can propose something.
yeah.
I'd like you to be able to propose something because it becomes a little more transparent to you what is there.
Mhm.
It's like a closed box,
Mhm.
and I want you to be able to look at how is it constructed. It's and how are the main motives for. These are the building blocks of our conceptions, philosophical and the conceptions of what a human being is. It's so much tied into language. This is why I love it. You look at language and you can, for any epoch, and you can see what conception of the human being is there.
Mm-hmm. True.
Is it a thinking machine? Is it what is it?
Is it visual? It's spoken. Okay.
Just so
Yes,
we-
of course.
Sorry, real quick interruption. I have to leave at 7.
We have to stop anyways before it's done because it's so nice to be in conversation, but of course it's too long.
And that's only just a few minutes, and I don't know how long you are gonna go,
We
but
will
if
stop
someone
at
could
7. We
record-
should-
Oh, okay. I wanna see the rest.
Yeah, we
At
have
some
to find
point,
a
yeah, okay.
possibility. Yeah.
Dr. Berteau?
Okay.
What?
Yeah,
Cheers.
sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That was it?
That was
I
it.
just wanna see
You want
3, 4, and 5.
3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, the following the thread of doing an
Okay,
activity.
we can finish this powerful blah, original moment, and then Karim, Azam.
Yeah,
excuse me.
but this metaphor of darkness and light, it's present in Eastern religions also.
Also,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I know. And I don't know if it's universal, so it's certainly in the European, so you have it in Sanskrit and all these, right? And all the languages that are surrounding this. I don't know about Africa, for instance. I have no idea. This is something, and there's certainly writing on that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think because of birth, because of the grounding universal experience of coming from darkness to light,
Okay.
which is a shock. It's a trauma, but it's a rite of passage. All the rites of passage work with darkness and light, okay?
Not to
So
mention
there,
Exactly.
and I think it's because of birth,
Mhm.
okay?
Yeah.
There's the Lakoff and Johnson that grounds it in your
Yeah,
bodily
Mhm.
experience.
Yeah, it makes sense that vision would be important to us.
yeah,
Evolutionarily.
it makes sense, but that we are totally fixated on
Yeah.
it, like exclusively fixated. This doesn't make sense.
Hmm.
And we are a hyper-visual society, right? All our doings, and we are constantly grasping with our eyes. Right? No, it's really,
It's true.
if you,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know from yoga, there are these exercises where you relapse your eyes and
Mhm.
you are,
Withdraw the senses, yes.
Mhm.
but also, yeah, withdraw the senses, but also just relax, just like relax the eyeballs in their
Mhm.
Sockets, yeah.
So just when you, because we look always focusedly, right? Da, da, da. And if we just have this panoramic look of, like, we can also just listen with the third ear. You may know this from psychotherapy. You can also look with the third ear eye.
Mhm.
So just very relaxed, right? So like it's a whole panorama. You can do this nice exercise with these two
Soft
sounds.
peripheral vision.
And it's, yeah, peripheral vision, and it's very different, and you will sense your, I hope we will do a little exercise.
But then you can't get those nice little lines right here.
Yeah.
I'm going for this.
Yeah.
right here.
I got it, I got it.
Exactly. Our attributes. Okay, so we will finish at 7, and I go to the next lines.
And I'm so sorry. So we're not gonna be able to get finished.
No.
I will feel better if I know another time that we can finish. So maybe, even if it's just a promise to finish one day.
So I would like to promise, but I cannot do without
Right.
you, of course.
But it's not a closed system, right?
Right.
Like,
Hey.
it keeps generating.
But we will find a solution.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'd like to, and maybe, so if you like, so at least we can.
Oh, I would
start.
love,
Yes,
I would
I
love to
want-
see this,
Yeah.
absolutely, I
Yeah.
agreed, yeah.
Okay, good. So we are at the end, I think.
Okay.
So, yes, so this is a kind of result. Yeah, this is the other, in chapter 3. So, the result is the Western tradition is heavy, forgetting the question to the answer, the other to the self, the lived common situation, that we are always somewhere. We are always with and somewhere, social, societal, situated, historical, cultural. Forgetting that bodies are language acting, that is, we are forgetting the language acting bodies. Excuse me, it's a little bit weirdly formulated. So, meaning that we forget that while speaking, we move and gesture. We have this process going on, and even in writing and speaking. So this is why we need a broader approach to language, and not saying language and oh yes, and it's embodied. No, from the start, please take another approach to language. It's speaking embodied with others. Okay,
Mhm.
speaking. So it's the psycho-spiritual body acting. Language falls into the gap separating body and mind somehow. It disappears in this. nowhere.
Hmm.
It becomes a visual structure of elements used to vehicle thoughts. And reason is always higher and touched and pure. It's always this kind of schema, right? And here's the structure of language. So we have a heavy written language bias, how it's called. We imagine language like this.
Yeah.
And we can point to it and we can fix it. And this is what we do a lot when we research in psychology, right?
Hmm.
Language loses its sounding tastes.
It is the.
Language becomes propositions that have truth values. This was our discussion. Not questions, sarcastic replies, desperate calls, happy repetitions of loving words. This is gone.
Hmm.
Remember the small set of you know, when she said in the MBI, small set of cognitive
Components.
Ah, yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Components, what a great word for these people, right? It's nothing, you don't know, it's just a placeholder. You can also say X, Y. But, and Bakhtin has this also, this, we have always a sarcastic reply, a loving word, a desperate call, whatever, but it's always this movement towards the other, and it has a taste, it has a tone, it has an intention towards the other, not, yeah, okay. Good, good for today, thank you, we'll find out possibilities. Yes,
That
exactly.
sounding tastes, at least the Eastern languages, Urdu, Persian, Arabic, they are losing their dialects. They used to have a lot of dialects. Urdu has several dialects.